Welcome to the Chinese Canadian Museum's podcast, The School Room. I'm your host, Melissa Lee, CEO of the museum. Thank you for joining us. On this episode, we are exploring a side of the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act that's less discussed by those outside of the community, the family separation and trauma that exclusion caused. Many people who know about the Exclusion Act know that it's the only immigration law in Canadian history to have prevented a particular group, a particular ethnicity from entering the country on the basis of race, specifically barring people of Chinese descent from legally entering Canada from 1923 until 1947, with very few exceptions. Preventing entry denied many prospective Chinese people opportunities for new experiences and economic gain in Canada. However, it also meant that the Chinese Canadians already in Canada were prevented from having their families join them in their new lives across the Pacific Ocean. So joining us today, we have a very special guest, Janet Bradley Worthington. Janet's grandfather, mother, father, aunt, and uncle all lived through and were impacted by the Exclusion Act, and we're fortunate to have all 5 of these family members' Chinese immigration certificates and stories in the Paper Trail archive and in our exhibition. Hi, Janet. Welcome to our show. Could you maybe begin telling us a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Thank you, Melissa. I'm happy to be visiting Vancouver specifically to see the Chinese Canadian Museum and the Paper Trail exhibit with my husband, Don. We live in New Hamburg, Ontario. I am one of 3 granddaughters of Mah Yick. I have a sister, Patty, who is the eldest granddaughter. My cousin, Teresa, is the youngest.
So I'm always giving tours of the Paper Trail exhibition in the museum. And part of my tour is to talk about your grandfather Mah Tin Yick. And the reason why I always tell his story is because it's really compelling to me and also to everyone I tell about his stories. Can you talk a little bit about him from your point of view?
Yes, I can. I listened to Catherine's podcast and was so touched that she would mention my family's story. My grandfather, Mah Yick, was born in 1866 in China, and at the age of 19, he came to Canada in June 1885, 1 month prior to the institution of the head tax. The documents I have indicate he arrived in Victoria. He came from China, Guangdong Province, Taishan District, Paksar, Bakheng. He had several different names: Mah Tin Yick, Mah Yick, Haojang, which was his courtesy name, but mostly he was referred to as Mah Yick. The Canadians, the Lofan, detested having so many Chinese and discriminated against them. And so many Chinese helped to build the CP rail, and many died doing that work. But after the end of the construction of the railway, xenophobia grew so violently that the government decided to enact legislation to keep more Chinese immigrants out and to document their every move in Canada. They were referred to as the Yellow Peril. I recently read that in Vancouver in 1907, there was a huge protest with several thousand marching through Chinatown carrying pennants that read, "For a White Canada."
That was the 1907 anti-Asian riots.
Yes, and I read about it upstairs. And I also read that in 1930 in Salmon Arm, and Mrs. Kinsey opened a laundry that only allowed all white help. Previous to that, in the Chinese opened Chinese restaurants or laundries, they were not allowed to hire white women. Anyway, Mrs. Kinsey was quoted as saying, "With 3 Chinese laundries in the town, there should be room for 1 white laundry." There was so much racism in BC that my mom and dad and many others had to move to Toronto to finish their post-secondary education and find employment, as they were not allowed to pursue a profession in BC.
It's really interesting how you've kind of painted the climate at the time, which was really racist. And in the middle of it is your grandfather, and he is known by multiple names, and partly is because, in a way, because of the racism, right? Like, he would be called one name, or on the register it would be written another. Is that why there were multiple names?
No, I have a feeling there were multiple names because when the immigration officers heard a name, they didn't know how to write it down. So there are many different spellings of names.
And when you refer to Lo Fan, that is the white settlers of the time. And Lo Fan is a Chinese, I guess, Cantonese word, right, for white settlers.
Right. I even call my husband a lo-fi.
You've so vividly painted this climate, which was so difficult for Chinese Canadians in the 1920s. And here in the middle is your grandfather. Do you know how he met your grandmother, or do you know any bit about that story and how they ended up building a life together and having two daughters?
It's a very good question. Well, first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about how we ended up settling in Salmon Arm.
For those that don't know where Salmon Arm is, it's located in the southern interior of BC, and it's in the middle between Kamloops and Revelstoke.
Yes, and it's located on the beautiful Shuswap Lake. When he came to Canada, it remains a mystery as to what he did from 1885 to 1913, when the Salmon Arm Observer newspaper published that he opened a laundry in August 1913 in Salmon Arm. And he was on his own then, I believe. So people I have asked about Mah Yick have surmised that often men came over and did any job they could to earn money to live and send home, save to get married or start a business. And as far as I can figure out, I think Mah Yick must have worked many jobs and traveled across BC to Salmon Arm, where he established his laundry, finally on Hudson Ave, near 3 hotels, and he ran that for over 32 years. It seems he had a good business because of his location, and he was able to travel to China from 1927 to 1929, which I learned from his CI-9, which was another travel document required by Chinese if they wanted to leave Canada, and they required to enter back. And he retained his business until September 1945. My Aunt Laura told me that my dad, David Gong, helped Mah Yick close up the shop and sell his business. And when I was researching, I found a manifest for my mom and dad, dated August 20th, 1945, for a trip to Vancouver, from Vancouver to Seattle on the Princess Charlotte. And I was glad to see that they had a holiday after settling Mah Yick in a Chinese men's home. And my aunt also told me that Mah Yick, who had throat cancer, helped all the other patients in the nursing home he later moved to in Vancouver. Now, you wanted to know about my grandmother. My grandfather was, quote, married, unquote, to Jean, but she is a mystery because I found no information about her except on her death certificate. That death certificate gives her name as Mah Yick, even though that's not her name. The death certificate indicates she was born in 1900 in China and came to Canada in about 1909. She died in January 1924, but her grave marker gives her name as Ng Lo Hao. But in Salmon Arm, her friends called her Jean. I don't know how she got to know Mah Yick. I do know she was his concubine, and that's why I can't find a marriage certificate, because most times there was no official marriage. I do know that there was a 34-year age difference. And in 1918, at the age of 18, Jean gave birth to my mom, Helen Yitsim Ma. And in November 1923, she gave birth to my aunt, Mary Laura Ma. And she was a very good mother to my mother. She sewed her beautiful clothes. She walked her down the street in her beautiful pram. I have pictures of that. And the church ladies really liked her a lot, and especially Mrs. Springer, who owned Reed and Company. She was very good to June. Anyway, 2 months after my Aunt Laura was born, in January 1924, Jean passed away. And Mah Yick was faced with a big problem, and because of the Exclusion Act, there were no Chinese women, or at least very few, available for him to marry and care for the girls. I think the stats show there was 1 Chinese woman for every 28 men. So because of the Exclusion Act, Mah Yick couldn't bring over the wife he had in China, which I just recently learned about. And so she couldn't care for the girls because no Chinese or very few were allowed into Canada.
And this was during the Exclusion Act, which had just passed.
Right. The Exclusion Act as of July 1st, 1923, and she died in January 1924.
Right.
If it hadn't been for that Exclusion Act, she might have been able to come over, and then I wouldn't be here. So my aunt told me that Mah Yick was going to sell or give the girls away. And my notes say that my mom was going to be sent to a family in Vernon. So there's some kind of connection with Vernon that I'm still trying to figure out. But Mrs. Springer, the woman who owned Reed and Company, told Mah Yick that the girls were not going to be separated and he was not going to send my mother to Vernon. So the women of the church and a Reverend Best of the church at the time told Mah Yick about the Oriental home and school in Victoria. And so just after my mom's 6th birthday in February 1924, and Mrs. Brown, whose husband worked for the CP Rail, took my mom and my aunt to the home in Victoria.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the Oriental home?
The Oriental home was initially the rescue home and was started in 1885 by John Etiquette Gardner, a missionary, with the support of Reverend Starr, a local Methodist minister. In 1908, the WMS, Women's Missionary Society, moved to 732 Cormorant Street, and the name of the home was changed from the rescue home to the Oriental Home and School. And that's where my mom and aunt lived. It was a good place to live. My aunt said all the teachers were the best and they weren't mean. I'm grateful that one of their core values was to offer a Christian education for Chinese and Japanese women and girls who lived there, because my mom and dad met through the United Church. So my mom stayed at the home until 1936, and then my aunt stayed until 1942. And after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the 18 Japanese girls at the Oriental home were taken to Saskatchewan, and the 6 remaining Chinese girls were sent to various homes to live. And my aunt had about 4 weeks left to go to finish high school, and she didn't finish it.
This Oriental home was really, it was a place where your mother and your aunt grew up, and they didn't leave until they were grown-ups naturally. That was usually the case for the girls that lived there. Is that correct, or?
Well, the Oriental Home and School, it was an amazing place, and the missionaries who ran that school were so courageous and strong and kind. They put their lives on the line to rescue the girls who were slave girls and prostitutes. And much has been written about that time. But when my mom and aunt entered, it wasn't like that. It was a wonderful school where they found a safe, secure place to live. And they were treated so well. They sold clothes for them. They bought birthday presents for them. And although my mom and aunt lived there, so many women and girls came and went. When a minister went on furlough to China, for example, he brought his 2 girls there to stay, and they took them in. And so if you ever look at the register for the Oriental Home and School, you will see a number of girls coming and going. And so there were so many people there at different times. So I looked at the school registers today, and you can see the class lists kept changing.
And the school closed down because of World War II in the end, because of the
Yes.
Japanese occupation.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is interesting to me that the way that you're able to trace the history of your family is in a way through records, and the records of the school, as well as the records of Chinese people that came over on the ship. And it's a way of tracing your story, it feels, through these papers that you're able to find. What does that feel like? Or do you feel like a detective? Is it something that you enjoy now at this time in your life? Tell us more.
I am thrilled to be able to find all this information about my parents and my grandfather, because I know a lot about my father, David Gung, and his family, but nothing was written about my moms. And to be able to have these records released, there are wonderful people who are helping. I helped to transcribe the CI-9 travel documents. There are thousands of them. And so when you ask me what it's like, you sit at your computer for hours and days and just look through many documents. And then all of a sudden, I'll say to my husband, "Look what I found." And yeah, it's very exciting when you find a little bit of information. And just recently, somebody helped me find Mah Yick and my grandmother in the 1921 census, and their names are really misspelled. And so they're called Merrick instead of Mah Yick, and she's called Lola instead of Lohao, but it's the right address. It's on Hudson, where the laundry was.
So that must make it even more difficult to find. You have to find the different alliteration of spelling as you go through all the lists, and it's almost like you're a detective and trying to piece together what or how it could be spelled.
And the writing is terrible. The writing in the school registers at the Oriental home was absolutely, unbelievably perfect, but not in the passenger lists of the general registers.
So I wanted to maybe ask you a little bit about your lives after your mom and your aunt left the Oriental home. I understand your aunt and uncle actually both enlisted in the Canadian Army during World War II. Could you tell us a little bit about their experience? Was it a major part of your family's lives?
I don't really think so, but it was a positive part for them. And my Aunt Laura will tell you that she had a dream that she would be in the Army. And she was in it for 2 years, underwent basic training in Kitchener. She was sent on a clerk's course and then went back to Vancouver to be a teletype operator in the Signal Corps. She said she didn't notice any racial discrimination whatsoever while enlisted, but she had to come to Toronto to look for work afterwards, as racial discrimination was still very widespread in BC. And she was one of the first Chinese Canadians to become a citizen after the repeal of the Exclusion Act.
So that would be in 1947. Mm-hmm.
Now, my Uncle Larry was born in Radcliffe, Saskatchewan, and he was a general serviceman, originally in the Edmonton Fusiliers, but then was shipped to the Newfoundland Regiment and then to the Princess Patricia's in Winnipeg. But his basic training was in Halifax. And the only story I remember about Uncle Larry being in the Army is that when he was so cold, he decided to put newspapers between the 4 blankets that they were issued. And the next morning, someone said, "Did you hear all that rustling last night? It can't be awake." And so that was the end of the newspapers between the blankets.
It's smart, though. It probably kept him warmer.
Anyway, Auntie Laura came back to Toronto, and she worked as a teletypist and then as an educational assistant. And Uncle Larry, he worked in Lychee Gardens, one of the top-notch, high-end Chinese restaurants in the original Toronto Chinatown. We just loved it there. And he was a night manager and shareholder, and It was great. My mom and dad did not enlist in the Army. Both of my parents had already moved to Toronto due to the ongoing discrimination against Orientals in BC. Before the war began, my mom had already trained as a nurse at Women's College Hospital in Toronto for 3 years. After graduation in 1942, she worked at Women's College Hospital and Mount Sinai Hospital until my sister was born in 1948. My mom was very active in the Alumni Association of Women's College Hospital and represented them at the International Congress on Nursing in Frankfurt, Germany. She was an occupational health and quarantine nurse at Pearson Airport before she was diagnosed with cancer and died at the age of 58 in 1976. My dad, David Gung, couldn't enlist due to a heart condition. He was an instrument maker before he opened his jewelry and watchmaking store in 1945. Community Jewelers was open until he passed away at the age of 51 in 1968. We lived in a diverse neighborhood in a Jewish area. We were the only Chinese family on our street, and we never felt any anti-Asian sentiment. In retrospect, it must have felt so good for my parents to live with such a sense of freedom and fairness.
Do you, I guess, think about being Chinese Canadian, or do you think more that you're Canadian?
That's a hard question because I don't speak Chinese, and that is a big, big regret. My dad tried to teach us Chinese in the basement of our home. I went to Chinese school, and if you don't have anybody to speak Chinese to, then you lose the language, or I never really had it. And my mom was raised by missionaries at the Oriental Women's School, so they didn't speak Chinese there. She took Chinese lessons because I found one of her books. But when they went to the United Church, I think everything was in English.
Right.
And I have her CGIT notes and Sunday school books, and they were all in English. So we didn't speak Chinese at home. And I really regret that.
Just thinking back also to the CI certificates, and when you examine them, you see at the very top, they actually say Department of Immigration and Colonization. So it really was the thought at the time that one should really colonize, or the government should really make everybody only speak English. Nobody was always thinking about retaining culture.
That's certainly what Sir Johnny MacDonald said. There's a quote upstairs that's saying, they should go home. They don't have our British, language. They don't have our culture. They don't belong here.
Is there anything else maybe you wanted to mention?
You asked, how do I identify? That's a question I hadn't thought about for a long while. In the past, some people have told me I was a banana, yellow on the outside and white on the inside, and that was so hurtful. So I hadn't really thought about that question for a long time. I identify as just myself, Canadian born with Chinese heritage of which I'm very proud. One of the drawbacks, as I mentioned, is I don't read or speak Cantonese, but that's because my mom was raised by white missionaries and she didn't speak much Chinese. My dad did, and he always spoke Chinese at the Chinese United Church. I guess you could say I'm a Juk Sing, a Chinese person who more readily or strongly identifies with Western culture than traditional Chinese culture, because my parents tried so hard to fit in when they moved to Toronto. But I embrace and am proud of what I know of Chinese culture and of the Chinese people who have been part of my life.
And today, how do you maintain your connection to your family and community?
We have a wonderful cousin on my dad's side, the Gung side. The Gungs were from Victoria, and my grandfather Gung came over and then brought his wife and his first son, and then there were 6 boys. My dad was the oldest and the youngest, and Uncle Edward was a doctor, and he was the doctor at the Oriental Home and School. He was also a doctor in China. The WMS, the United Church helped him go to university and to become a medical doctor in Toronto. The WMS helped my mom and sent her $100 a month when she was at nursing school in Toronto. But with respect to maintaining connections with my community, we're having the 3rd Gung family reunion in Toronto this summer. And the first one was in Victoria, and the second was in Calgary. And everybody has enjoyed all the tidbits of information I found out through the last 2 or 3 years, through Ancestry or looking at newspapers, and now on this trip looking at the school records of the home and the United Church. So I've just learned a lot on this trip that means so much, because the deaconesses who taught my mom and were in the Chinese church here went to the Toronto Chinese church and taught me.
The same deaconesses?
Yes, it's like a full circle. Except my mom never told me that same deaconess who taught me CGIT taught her when she was a little girl in Victoria.
So you found out later that this happened?
Yeah, this trip.
Wow.
It's been amazing.
And why is the reunion in different places? Why is it in Victoria and then Calgary? Are there a lot of Gongs in different provinces?
No, we're a small family, and actually the Gong family started out in Victoria, so that's why we had it first there. And it has a wonderful Chinatown, of course, the first. And then Calgary, we have family there, and that's where my mom went after she had to leave the Oriental home and earn money to be able to travel to Toronto. And then Toronto, we have family here as well.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Janet.
I'd like to thank you and the Chinese Canadian Museum for your interest in my grandfather's story and for showcasing the effects of the Exclusion Act on my mom, aunt, and grandfather. My grandfather lived the rest of his life without a partner after my grandmother died in 1924. There are only 3 of us left in the family related to Mah Yick, and I feel privileged to be here today to provide a little more insight into Mah Yick's story, knowing it will live on thanks to the museum. I'm sure my grandfather and my mom would be so pleased to know someone is interested in their lives.
For anyone interested in learning more about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the story of those who lived it, please visit us, our feature exhibition, The Paper Trail to the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act, on view at our Vancouver location in the historic Wing Sang building on 51 East Pender Street. This podcast was recorded on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We invite you all to reflect on the territories that you're on and the host nations. To learn more about the Chinese Canadian Museum and book tickets, visit us at ChineseCanadianMuseum.ca and follow us on Instagram at CCMuseumBC for updates. The School Room is presented by the Chinese Canadian Museum, hosted by Dr. Melissa Carmen Lee, produced by Rosalie Gonawan, and advised by Catherine Clement. Production is supported by Noah Taylor and the Walrus Lab. The theme music and original audio was created by Joshua Young, and graphic design is by Studio Pian Pian He and Max Harvey. Stay tuned for next month's episode of The Schoolroom, available wherever you get your podcasts.